Well, they used it to prisoners. But you don't. And then it was in the presidency, it was not to the Belgium. I had Belgium had no place in the prison.
In het begin ook goed doen voor de Peter, dat zij ook aanwezig zijn. Moeten we even switchen naar hen om te tonen dat ze aanwezig zijn.
Als ik misschien kijk, want ik ga bij hen zijn, dat zij er ook zijn. Zou dat kunnen, als je dat doet, wil ik dan even switchen?
Als je wil, mogen we zelf, zullen we zelf ook switchen. Als je op HDMI drukt, zijn ze zichtbaar.
Ah ja, dus op HDMI
Ja.
en om terug te doen,
Dan moet je terug naar PC drukken.
dus HDMI PC.
Ja,
Ah,
dus dan ga je ze
oké,
switchen.
dan ga ik
Ga je ze voorlopig, ga ik het geluid nog niet opzetten, want ze zijn nog aan babbelen. En anders gaan we dat hier allemaal weer over.
Ja.
Dus ik ga ze voorlopig geen geluid geven, maar als ze zouden willen praten, ga ik ervoor zorgen dat er geluid is.
Ja. Oké, dus ik ga ze doen. Als ik het hier juist zeg, dan ga ik gewoon een keer op HDMI doen.
Ja.
Dan kunnen ze ze zien.
En dan druk ik dat gewoon terug op
Oeh, wow.
PC
That is
en dan
very
is het
well
terug op
prepared.
presentatie.
We have to ask that to the publisher. We have someone here from the publishing house, so they should know that. But unfortunately, these books are really expensive. So if you cannot order them like for the library, I think I don't know what the price is, like 150 euros or something.
Fabienne? Gaan we hen? Ja, aan hen. Als jullie mij tikken hier, dan ga ik bij hen. Kunnen we bij hen? Ja.
Zet u maar zo.
Dear Excellencies, dear ladies and gentlemen, it is our pleasure to officially present our edited volume, Principled Pragmatism in Practice, the EU's policy towards Russia after Crimea, which was recently published in the EU External Relations series of the international publisher Brill Nijhoff. And we're particularly honored to do this in the presence of such distinguished guests, and also with most of our contributors either in the room or some of them are also following online. If everything works well, we should be able to see them. So I invite them to switch on their cameras so that we can actually see them. They should be able to hear me, right? Okay. So if there would be questions from one of the audience, for one of the authors at the end, that should also be possible for them to intervene. So our book is the result of a cooperation, a collaboration that started within the framework of the Ghent University's Russia platform. And the Russia platform, for those who don't know the Russia platform, that is an initiative of Ghent University, which started about 5 years ago, and which brings together all scholars in Ghent University that are interested in one way or another in Russia. And this is how Fabienne Bossuyt, the co-editor of the book, working at the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences, and myself, I'm working at the Faculty of Law and Criminology, how we started to work together for the organization of the very first Ghent colloquium, which has become an annual tradition ever since. And the first colloquium was organized in 2017 under the title EU-Russia Relations, How to Get Out of the Midlife Crisis. That was the title of the event at that time. We brought together scholars, practitioners from the EU, from Russia, to all share their views, essentially to share their views on the EU's global strategy on foreign security policy, on the recent developments in the EU's approaches towards Russia. And afterwards, we organized some follow-up workshops here in Ghent. And the result of all these discussions is actually the book which we present today and which you can see here in front of on the table. It was our deliberate choice to include not only European but also Russian authors to work on this book because we thought that it's very important to have a confrontation of various views, perceptions that is crucial for this topic. So we think that the inclusion of authors, contributors with different background, not only different academic background, but also different background in terms of their institutions where people work, the different educational background, that is an asset of the book. At least this is our view, this is our conviction. Now, as can be derived from the title of the book has a specific focus. The focus is the study of the EU's policy towards Russia, particularly starting with the EU's global strategy, which was adopted in 2016. And in the same year, we also had the adoption of 5 guiding principles that are still today the policy framework for the EU's Russia relations. And a crucial concept, a crucial notion in these documents is the concept of principled pragmatism, which basically means that the EU will remain firm when it comes to respect for international law, for democracy, for human rights on the one hand, but at the same time there is also some leeway for pragmatic cooperation in areas of shared interest. So translated into Russia relations, it means that the EU is quite firm when it comes to questions of Crimea, eastern Ukraine on the one hand, but on the other hand, the door is somehow left open to cooperate on areas of common interest. Think about climate change, the situation in the Middle East, or the fight against terrorism. And more specifically, this notion of principled pragmatism that has been operationalized in practice through these 5 guiding principles. These 5 guiding principles, which also are translated or can be found in the structure of the book, because the aim of our book was to take stock of the implementation of those 5 guiding principles. We try to look at the current state of play, the challenges. We try to find out what works better or what are the most problematic areas with respect to the implementation of these 5 guiding principles, and also to take a forward-looking angle to see what perhaps can be improved for the future. So this is, let's say, the structure of the book, focused on these 5 guiding principles, starting with the first one. The first of these guiding principles concerns the state of implementation of the Minsk agreements, which was signed in September 2014 and February 2015, with a view to end the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And that's a precondition for the revision of the EU's sanctions regime against Russia. Now, as is argued in the book, the implementation of the Minsk agreements is proving quite difficult, not at least because we have divergent perceptions and perspectives on the responsibilities of the parties involved, of the sequencing of the responsibilities and the actions to be taken. So whereas the EU in particular will focus on the role of Russia in the de-escalation process, we could see that Russia, on the other hand, refers to the responsibilities of Ukraine and of the European Union. So we can see kind of blame game that for the time being implies that we still have a continuation of the sanctions regime for quite some years now, with all legal and political challenges that are involved. And all these legal and political challenges concerning the sanctions regime are also analyzed in various contributions in the book, as you can see on the slides. Now, the second guiding principle of EU-Russia relations, and also a second part of the book, that remarkably does not concern Russia directly, but it concerns the shared neighborhood between the EU and Russia, which is linked to the understanding that the development of EU-Russia bilateral relations cannot easily be disconnected from the direct neighborhood, meaning the EU's relations with other former Soviet republics, and in particular with the development of regional integration in that region, leading to the establishment of the Eurasian Economic Union as a new reality. So that is why, for instance, one of the contributions in the book will look specifically at the relations with Armenia, Armenia being a very interesting case study as a country that initially had started association negotiations or negotiations towards an association agreement with the European Union, but afterwards terminated these negotiations and became a member of this Eurasian Economic Union, but nevertheless managed to have a new bilateral legal framework with the European Union in the form of a comprehensive and enhanced partnership agreement. Now, other specific issues that were tackled under the second guiding principle concern more specific questions, the questions of the so-called de facto states, frozen conflicts, also called sometimes, in the Eastern European periphery, and questions or practices of visa diplomacy, passportization, and so on, are all phenomena that we could witness in this shared neighborhood between the European Union and Russia. Now, the third guiding principle and the third part of the book that concerns the question of the EU's resilience to Russian threats. Resilience is also one of those key concepts which always come back in the EU's official discourse, particularly when it concerns relations with Russia. And it basically implies the EU's ambition to become more resilient with respect to Russian threats. That includes questions of military, hybrid threats, but also questions of energy dependence on Russia, which remains very topical these days if we think about the discussions on Nord Stream 2, if we look at the increasing gas prices. This is, of course, of direct relevance to all of us. Now, what is quite interesting is to see that energy, for instance, that's part of this third guiding principle, the EU's resilience to Russian threats. At the same time, we can also see that this is also part of the fourth guiding principle, the principle on selective engagement with Russia. We also have there a contribution on energy, meaning that energy is at the same time a potential threat, dependence. At the other hand, it's also a potential opportunity for selective engagement if we take into account the global challenge of climate change, if we take into account the EU's ambitions with respect to its own Green Deal, then of course issues such as the greening of Russia's energy sector is one of the areas where we think there might be additional scope for selective engagement with Russia, among other areas such as cooperation on transnational security risks, tackling organized crime, or specific cooperation in the Arctic. Now, the fifth and last guiding principles, but not the least, I would say, and also the fifth and last part of our book that concerns the EU's approach towards Russia's civil society and the promotion of people-to-people contacts. That is, I would argue, increasingly important in a context of strained official relations between the EU and Russia. So it's important to invest in social ties through student exchanges, also what we try to do at our university, in civil society cooperation, in research, in cross-border cooperation and business contacts. And taking into account the difficult domestic situation and strained options for formal cooperation, we could see that the assistance to civil society and people-to-people contacts also requires new approaches, such as a growing emphasis on cultural relations, on public diplomacy, and last but not least, we also focused on Russia's integration in the European higher education area, which is still on the agenda and increasingly focuses on cooperation in this area of education and research. That is, as we argue in the book, an increasingly important part of EU-Russia relations, even though it has so far been a less studied area of cooperation. On this note, I want to pass the floor to Fabienne.
Dear Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, so what about the conclusions of our book? Huh? So, of course, that's the most interesting question. So, what is the outcome of our book when it comes to the assessment of the EU's policy towards Russia since the annexation of Crimea? Well, first of all, we, of course, need to highlight that several developments in the past year have shown that the EU's relations with Russia continue deteriorating. And clearly, the relations between the EU and Russia remain at an all-time low, and they're even sliding further backwards. And this is, of course, very worrisome, not least considering Russia's location as the EU's biggest neighbor, and also considering the high interdependence between the EU and Russia. The contributions to our book offer insights that help to explain some of the dynamics that are underlying the worsening relationship. Clearly, these dynamics will need to be addressed or will need to be taken into account in any future attempts to overhaul the EU's policy towards Russia, specifically if we want to overhaul the current policy based on the 5 principles in favor of a more long-term strategy. Now, when it comes to the 5 guiding principles, our book shows that the EU has achieved some progress in implementing these principles, but the progress has not really been evenly spread across the 5 principles. And we actually found that the 5th principle, which concerns the EU's support to civil society and the EU's strengthening of people-to-people contacts, well, that one actually seems to have been the most successful so far. Now, when it comes to the 5 guiding principles, our book shows that the EU has I was just hearing myself in the background. But when it comes to the 4 other principles, we found that, the results are rather mixed. In general, we actually can conclude that in some cases we have found contradictory results when it comes to the 5 principles and sometimes even counterproductive results. So this makes us conclude that when it comes to the 5 principles, well, they clearly needs to be revised. Now, more than ever, we argue that there is a need of evidence-based insights in order to be able to reassess the current policy so that it can be improved where necessary. Our book has provided specific cues on what is working and what is not working. First of all, we think it's important to highlight that the profound discord between the EU and Russia is reflected in the 2 actors' diverging images and perceptions of themselves. This has really engendered a deeply ingrained misunderstanding and lack of trust. Diverging images and perceptions of each other are really major obstacles to the enhancement of the relations between the EU and Russia. And so it's essential to understand how these divergences have emerged and how they have been manifested in the past years. This is important not only in order to be able to identify possible confidence-building measures in order to eventually restore trust, but also in order to try and develop a common vision for cooperation between the EU and Russia, something which unfortunately does not seem very likely to happen in the foreseeable future. Then a key element in the current discord is that the EU and Russia have divergent views on security, and they disagree fundamentally on what constitutes and safeguards the European security order. This has been clearly manifested in their opposing views on the Ukraine crisis. Several of our contributions to the book have demonstrated this, and they show that the EU and Russia have promoted their own interpretation of events. They seem to present each other as the opponent, and they hold conflicting perspectives on the sequencing, for instance, of the implementation process of the Minsk agreements, but also, for instance, on the responsibilities of the parties involved. Then another important aspect that has impeded constructive cooperation between the EU and Russia is the so-called mismatch between the EU's ambitions as a global norm setter, which is actually perceived as paternalistic from a Russian point of view. And on the other hand, Russia's ambitions to become a norm setter in its own right. And several chapters in the book, especially those written by Russian authors, they argue that this mismatch lies at the basis of the worsening relationship between the EU and Russia and the difficulty between them to engage in cooperation. And this has really been gradually manifested actually since already the early 2000s. And as also has been shown by several of the chapters, Russia has no interest in cooperating with the EU if it can only be this passive consumer of EU norms. Instead, Russia really seeks recognition as an equal actor in today's multipolar world. And so Russia really wants to move beyond this master-pupil relationship or this donor-recipient relationship. And this can be observed, among other things, in specific areas such as higher education, but also in the field of transnational security threats. So far, as some of the authors argue in the book, the EU has shown rather limited readiness to answer Russia's desire for cooperation on an equal footing. In fact, the EU's global strategy has further cemented this binary logic of the EU, meaning that it's asking Russia to conform to the EU's vision of security and cooperation, and it identifies Russia as a strategic challenge as long as Russia does not conform to the European vision and view on this. Then last but not least, some of the chapters in the book have also provided further insights, really important insights, into the role of the EU member states when it comes to the EU's policy towards Russia. Now, at the moment, all EU member states, they still formally agree with the sanctions policy and the 5 guiding principles, and so unity prevails on the surface. And this is an important remark to make because yes, there are very deep divisions between the member states when it comes to the policy towards Russia. These are divisions that already predate the Ukraine crisis, and we can see that they have re-emerged in the past few years. And this current profound disagreement among the EU member states is making it extremely difficult for the EU to find a way out of the lingering impasse in its relations with Russia. So the key challenge for the EU in defining a new long-term strategy for the future of EU-Russia relations will be to develop a common vision for cooperation which is based on mutually acceptable parameters. And in this regard, basically the challenge for the EU is double, because it needs to develop a vision that is shared not only between the EU and Russia, but also internally between all 27 member states. And on this rather pessimistic note, I end our introductory presentation of the book, and I will now hand over the floor to our keynote speakers, His Excellency Ambassador Vladimir Chisov and Mr. Luc de Vigne. So our keynote speakers will share with us their views on the findings of the book, as well as also their assessment of the EU's policy towards Russia in the past few years. So, Your Excellency Ambassador Chisov, the floor is yours. Please, you can come over here.
Can I speak?
Well, I've been told that the quality is not so good of the microphone there, and it's a bit better here.
Okay. Thank you. I take the book. Yeah. Don't fall over. Don't touch. Just a minute. Good evening, everybody. Dear professors, Peter and Fabienne, dear members of the faculty, dear students, I believe this is a very good and well-prepared occasion to take a look at Russia-EU relations, addressing primarily 3 basic questions. First, how it all started.
Second, how we got to this sorry state. And third, what do we do to get out of this mess? I will start with several short comments on the book itself. I think that Russia-EU relations have lately become a subject of an ever-increasing number of research efforts of various degrees of depth in analysis in various places, which proves that Russia-EU relations has become an interesting subject. Having said this, I must admit that unfortunately many works that are published today, they suffer from, I would say, political influence. But the book that we are being presented today, I believe, is indeed a serious attempt at comparative analysis, which has managed to avoid extremes, which makes it not only more interesting, but also quite useful. So my congratulations to the authors and the editors, of course. The subject described in the book is, I would say, a set of mostly well-known facts. There are different angles to our multifaceted relationship: legal, political, presentational, and perceptional. Fabienne spoke about diverging misperceptions of each other. I'm afraid she is quite right. And continuing misperceptions, they are a factor which is quite detrimental to mutual confidence. This is one of the reasons why our relations are as complicated as they are. So the value of scientific research as that contained in the book is that it provides a solid basis for outlining perspective. So I would actually suggest two things for the time when you think of publishing a second edition. One would be include a chapter on economic relations, which is lacking in this first edition. Because economic relations are indeed an objective foundation of Russia-EU cooperation. And the role of business, the business communities of both sides, has been quite important and has actually turned out to be quite a stabilizing factor. In spite of the understandable competition between producers, exporters, those initiating anti-dumping procedures, but overall, the business element of our relations has been producing a stabilizing effect on politicians and others. And the second piece of advice, if I may, is that perhaps the second edition will at some point require a concluding chapter on the way ahead answering the third of the three questions that I posed. Now, I've been specifically asked to outline my view of EU policy towards Russia. Well, as somebody who has been dealing with Russia-EU relations for broadly 22 years now, directly, including the over 16 years that I've spent in Brussels in my current posting. Yes, indeed, people don't live that long, I know. Anyway, the European Union, the Russia-EU relations have been unfolding against the background of the evolution of the EU itself. And looking back at the whole history of the European integration project, it has evolved continuously, I would say, from a war prevention mechanism in the 1950s to a shining castle on top of the hill, then to Vanity Fair, then to a lubricant of different interests of member states. It was always a combination of what is called the pull factor and the push factor. Well, I try to be objective. I would say that even today, even after Brexit, the pull factor still exists, and perhaps it outweighs, if not dominating, but it still outweighs the push factor. We'll see, though, how things unfold in the future. The Russia-EU relations also went through a certain evolution from regarding, on the Russian side, from viewing the European Union as a source of ideals and money to the stage when it was mostly viewed as a technological supermarket, and then as a competitor. Today, unfortunately, more as an adversary. The sort of starting point for the book and the research behind it was placed in 2014. And the event was Reunification of Crimea with Russia. This is the term that I will certainly insist on. Those who have been dealing with our relations in the preceding period will agree that certain negative trends were quite visible before that. Though trade was booming, actually we reached in 2012 and 13, we reached this, a level when mutual trade was at about €1 billion a day. But we had some difficulties because perhaps misperceptions were already making their way. We had, for example, I'll give two examples. One is we had lengthy negotiations on further visa facilitation, building up on the 2006 agreement, and in parallel on a visa-free regime. And every time we were almost there, the European Union backtracked. I can recall 3 or 4 times. The second common project was in the area of peacekeeping. We had some positive experience in faraway countries of Africa, where Russian and EU military contingents cooperated quite successfully. Though one specific operation that I can recall was the one in Chad. There was a conflict, I remember. The problem on our side was that we lacked a proper legal basis for that. So every time we intended to launch a common operation with our EU partners, we had to follow stringent internal procedures. So what we suggested was to conclude an agreement, which would be a sort of a framework agreement covering all types, Russia participating in EU-led operations, EU participating in Russia-led operations, and there was a project about Transnistria in that sense, and also our common interaction under the UN peacekeeping flag. Well, unfortunately, that didn't materialize because the EU took a very clear-cut position. Either you participate or not. We are the norm setters, which is, of course, a specific example of the past period, but it's a reflection of a broader crisis, which was actually which is mentioned in the book and was mentioned by the editors. One of the roots of the problem was the lack of an unbiased view, and I would say that was mutual, the lack of an unbiased view of each other. The fact that we live in an evolving multipolar world, which is now accepted by everybody, has not found its way into EU strategic thinking. The balances are shifting. And I would say that the tendency of the European Union to act as a global norm setter in our relations is a non-starter. When we hear from the European Union, but also from other sources, on this side of the globe, the other side, about a world order based on rules, the immediate question arises, what are the rules? Can anyone spell them out? Nobody does. Second question, who writes the rules? Who votes for them? Who adopts them? Since 1945, we all have a universal set of rules, which is the UN Charter. Yes, I agree the world is evolving, and the UN itself perhaps will be the subject of reform at an appropriate moment when there is broad consensus on that. But in the meantime, it's the UN Charter that is the set of rules universal for everybody. Trying to circumvent it by inventing a different set of rules, by a group of countries more advanced, more democratic than the others, may lead the world to further divisions. So, a broad overview of the 32 years of bilateral history, because our bilateral history starts with the first treaty between the then Soviet Union still and the European communities that was signed in the famous now year of 1989. An overview leads us to conclude that the EU has passed through several stages of treating Russia, I would say, or addressing Russia as a partner. And the notion of assisting Russia's democratization or transition to market economy, which was voiced back then in '89 and actually found its way into the text of the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, which is still in force, but it was signed back in 1994. And at some point we all agreed that it is high time for us to have a new bilateral agreement. And we actually started negotiations, which unfortunately stumbled after a couple of years, and since December 2010, they are formally speaking in a technical pause without any prospect of being renewed at this point, I'm afraid. Trying to democratize Russia, then outlining various forms of partnership with Russia, then partnership for modernization, if you remember the term. They all failed because, as precisely outlined by the editors, because of EU's inability to view Russia as an equal partner, to accept plurality of views, historical experiences, and I would say values too. Another factor which, of course, has been hindering is the belief that Europe is the European Union. I would say that is not only geographically incorrect, but also in terms of substance. So, for Russia, relations with the EU have always been a self-standing foreign policy and economic policy track. We are not pivoting to Asia or anywhere else. The Russian eagle, as you know, looks both ways. A few words on shared neighborhood, which is one of the chapters of this book. You know, we have seen this area, which consists of a number of independent sovereign countries, also evolving from an area of shifting dividing lines, which many people thought were a thing of the past, then to a collection of irritants, and ultimately, unfortunately, to an area of competition, which is quite unhelpful. The you know, the Russian Federation never objected to EU enlargement as different from our view of NATO enlargement, of course, but that's a different issue. So we believe that EU enlargement is a regional dimension of globalization, you could put it that way, which of course does not mean that the countries that are aspiring to join the European Union should relinquish all their ties and links to Russia and other countries, non-EU countries. So this is an area where we should be discussing mutual interests, and of course for those countries that are members of different integrational schemes, in full accordance with Russia-EU roadmap for one of the four common spaces that were referred to, that all integration processes in this part of Europe should be compatible, mutually compatible, and equally recognized. Well, I believe that describes overall my personal view of our relations and what we expect from our partners. We never considered the EU as an adversary, much less an enemy. We consider the EU as a partner. We, for as long as I remember, we were accused of trying to drive wedges between member states on the one hand and the EU structures. That has never been the case as far as Russia's positions are concerned or Russia's efforts. So we are prepared to continue our relations on an equal footing with the European Union and its member states. We all understand that some member states are perhaps more interested in promoting relations with Russia, others less, but this is a European Union which is not a super state. It's a union of independent and sovereign countries. That is how we view the European Union, and that's how we are prepared to deal with it. Thank you.
Dear professors, dear Ambassador Chizov, ladies and gentlemen, pleasure to be here and thank you for the invitation in this beautiful historical building in the University of Ghent, a city which had been a long time also between Kingdom of France and other in the region and birthplace of Charles Quint. So let's not compare the today's situation between EU and Russia to these imperial fights of the past, but there may be something to come back. But first of all, I want to congratulate the authors of this important publication that we're discussing today, and I think the complexity and the depth of the topic indeed is worthwhile studying. Ourselves, back already 5 years ago, our EU delegation in Russia, as well as the Russian International Affairs Council, we had also initiated a EU-Russia experts network on foreign policy that keeps meeting, and I think it's always good to discuss. So congratulations for this book. I will also divide my presentation in three parts. What is the perspective of the EU institutions on today's state of play of our relations. Secondly, how we got there, and if the ambassador allows me, I might have a few divergences of his own explanations. And then, what is the way ahead? I will agree with the ambassador that perhaps the economic dimension was missing, because indeed Russia is our fifth largest trading partner today. It used to be the third, and actually it used to be the third when I was in charge of it 10 years ago, but there's no connection between. But it's no. The connection is not Brexit. The connection is also.
From number 4 to number 5 because of the UK.
It is not the case. So it is also because of Russia's sanctions on EU trade. And before that, and no. The EU sanctions are not on Russia trade. This is different. The only sanctions on trade per itself is. In terms of import, is from Crimea directly. But let me come back to it. So, by contrast, we are by far the largest trading partner of Russia, and we account roughly for 38% of Russia's trade. And more importantly, we are the largest investor in Russia. So, we believe in the future of Russia, you could say. And we have about 3/4 of the total foreign direct investment in Russia. It is true that the relations continue backsliding for the time being, which is unfortunate. For Russia and EU have shared and share a common history, common geography, and by and large, common culture. Of course, the history is different if you are in Warsaw, Tallinn, or Madrid or Paris. That is quite obvious, and perhaps that explains a number of things. But I think today, indeed, the relations are not good. And if I have to quote the Ambassador Chizov, he recently said the EU has become a multi-headed monster that many in Russia don't comprehend, and the number of heads keep increasing. I thought that with Brexit the number of heads would decrease, but there you go. So indeed, the relation is not good, and it is all the more unfortunate that back in 1990 in Paris, with the Paris Charter and the OSCE, we had all agreed to have relations based on respect and cooperation, and this is far from being the case. Now, how do we get there? And I think in the book you are calling this a problem of normative discord and identity clash, and I would certainly agree to that. And I think that the clash of, if you want, normative discord is on three parts. It's on politics or geopolitics, it's on economics, and it's also on human rights. If I start by geopolitics, the ambassador has referred to the reunification of Ukraine in 2014. Of course, we do not recognize what we consider as an illegal annexation. That is quite obvious, and I would say that plus the still ongoing, unfortunately, Russian aggression against Ukraine, with its several thousands of dead, has played a very negative triggering effect. The continued passportization, which is illegal, of residences in Donetsk and Lugansk regions, illegal because Ukrainian law does not allow dual citizen, and Russian know that very well, has of course worsened the situation. But I don't want to use our time here to exchange which are dramatical views on situation in Ukraine, because I think it would be a waste of time. The positions are well known. But it is important, I think, to say, to convey the message that this is obviously a triggering effect. But the triggering effect had deep and older causes, and here I will disagree with the ambassador on a couple of things. First of all, the common neighborhood. The ambassador mentioned that the countries which were ex-Soviet republics were fully sovereign, which is what we agree. But he also said something which is a bit different, which is discuss together their future. And this is the problem. That if these countries are sovereign and if they want to associate themselves with the EU in one form or another, well, on which ground shall we force them to discuss with a third country? And this is what I would call a fundamental, if you want, clash/cultural clash. Russia has seen, I believe, the policy of the Eastern Partnership as fundamentally hostile to it, which it is not. And even if Russia would see that the author or the originator of the policy would be hostile, to believe that a policy which has been endorsed now for many years by all 27 member states, many of them, actually the majority of them, having traditionally good relations with Russia, it's, I think, deeply flawed. And we could see that the deterioration of the relations was also parallel with the progression of the EU relation with the Eastern partners. And there is nothing in that policy, Eastern Partnership, that is hostile to Russia. Now, the ambassador mentioned something which is the compatibility, that we had to ensure the compatibility in different integration models. This is very interesting, because it is not the EU that forced countries to choose. It is Russia that did so. Why and how? We have offered free trade agreements, an association agreement which is political nature, but free trade agreement to Eastern partners that were willing to do so. 4 of them decided to do so: Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, and Armenia. Eventually, Armenia changed its mind. We can all speculate why, it doesn't matter here. But Russia, at the same time, created a customs union. Now, customs union and free trade agreements are very different things. And since I'm with academics, I don't need to remind that once you join a customs union, you may not have your own free trade agreement. No member state of the European Union can have its own FTAs. It's all or nothing. And by doing that, Russia was actually forcing countries like Ukraine to choose that either it had an FTA with the EU or it had customs union with Russia. The ideal solution would have to be that simply Ukraine could keep its existing FTA with Russia and have another one with the EU. Both are completely mutually compatible. Just like the EU has lots of free trade agreements with many countries around the world who themselves have sometimes FTAs between themselves or not. There are 1,200 FTAs around the world. So, but Russia changed that. This is important. And then Ukraine was really caught because Ukraine knew, and the others as well, that the investment that they massively needed after an exit of Soviet Union, which left them massively underinvested, would only come from the West, not the East, and the technology that they needed as well. This is nothing derogatory to say that. There's lots of very high technology in Russia. It's not a country deprived of technology, but when it comes to industrial use of technology, industrial development, look at the numbers. Russia's exports is 80% energy and raw materials, whereas EU has none and is exporting either food or industrial goods or intellectual property, etc. So this was a big problem. And unfortunately, and I attended the last, I think, 8 summits between EU and Russia, I never heard the Russian side say, we have a problem with this Eastern Partnership and these agreements. And so what happened is that Russia tried at the last minute, succeeded in the case of Armenia and Ukraine temporarily to convince them not to sign. Now, my question has always been, Serbia has a free trade agreement with Russia, has a free trade agreement called association as well with EU. Why was Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, Armenia not allowed to be treated like Serbia? That is a fundamental question, and as soon as these countries signed with the EU, they were victim of embargoes and trade embargoes and further sanctions, etc., by Russia. And that is a fundamental difference. Now, I'm very happy to hear that the ambassador mentioned that he doesn't see this Eastern Partnership policy with our common neighborhood as hostile, but the facts, unfortunately, are a bit different. A second clash is interesting as well, and it predates what I was mentioning, which is basically the years 2013, 14 and onwards, is an economic division, the clash between different economic views. The ambassador mentioned the new agreement, new bilateral agreement that we're negotiating, and I was in charge of trade part back then in the years 2008, 9, 10, 11. And what we saw was that fundamentally, and this corresponded to the change between the presidency of Medvedev and Putin, that suddenly, and because I still remember President Medvedev saying at his last summit in 2011 that he wanted that the Russian industrial norms, I'm not talking about norms in general or political norms, I'm talking about industrial norms, would be aligned on EU, which is logical. Why is it logical? Not because the EU is better, but because the EU for 30 years has been part of all international normalization agreements and institutions. And if you have a globalized economy and you have an industry that's globalized, it doesn't start happily making different norms, applying different norms of production for market A, market B, etc. Now, in 2012, this changed radically, and I remember President Putin saying exactly the opposite. I also remember that in 2012, which was the year of WTO accession of Russia, which we supported all the way through, even if we were disappointed because Russia did not respect its commitments as of the moment they joined, by creating recycling fees on cars, not respecting reduction of tariffs on pulps and papers, etc. And all this ended up in dispute settlement. But Russia, when Russia joined WTO, President Putin said, "This is the end of liberalization. I now have to protect Russia farmers, Russia industry, etc." Now, this is a fundamental problem. The EU and Russian economy are perfectly not compatible, but complementary. Complementary. EU's got energy. Russia's got energy. We need energy. We have a lot of technology investment that Russia would need. The problem is that we need norms. Russia does not need norms in terms of economic exports, because Russia, as I was mentioning, is basically on energy and raw materials, and these don't need norms. Everything we produce, food, cars, medicine, etc., needs norms. So what do we do when we make a bilateral agreement? We try to have norms that makes the life of our producers easier. Now, if you suddenly say, I can't go any further than WTO, what is the added value of making a bilateral agreement? You kill the negotiations. And these negotiations were stopped because Russia didn't want to go further in nothing politically, purely economic norms. This is not EU being superior, this is an economic reality. And the third clash, after the first geopolitical, the second, which is in economic terms, is of course in human rights. Now, when the ambassador was mentioning, we have UN, we have one universal norm, which is UN, etc. I would add that we also have the Council of Europe, we also have the OSCE, all of which, of course, Russia is part. And so when we criticize Russia for the situation in human rights and democracy, which is unfortunately going from bad to worse, things around Navalny, things around foreign agent legislation, what we see, historical revisionism, etc., this is not because it's our norms, it's because we believe this does not fit, this does not respect the obligations that Russia has freely subscribed in OSCE and other international norms. So it is not a question of us being better, it's about what we see is a lack of if you want, implementation of free subscribed norms. Now, where does this lead us? And this is my third and last part. Indeed, today we have these 5 guiding principles, and it is yes, it is true that member states, of course, and this is evidenced by various national politicians' declarations, have different views on Russia, EU-Russia relations. But they may have different views, but they have a unanimous action since 2014, because every 6 months the sanctions need to be renewed by unanimity. And
Tatiana was not able to join us here physically because of the COVID pandemic, so she will be talking online. But let me first give the floor to Tony van der Tocht.
Thank you, Fabienne. Thank you, Peter. Great honor to be here and to have been part of this whole exercise. on other issues not based on fossil fuels like hydrogen. One element the book highlighted is the limited success story of this principle, the last principle, the education, science, culture. But I must say, yes, it was, and also when looking at the 4 common spaces which we had before, that space was most effective, in fact. But this one is also threatened by, increasingly repressive measures, foreign agent legislation in the Russian Federation. So I'm seriously concerned whether in 5 years' time this can still be called a limited success. But also there, I mean, it's up to Russian policy. One final point. The book concludes by, in fact, calling for real strategy, EU strategy on Russia. And also, the latest communication is it's an update, it's a more elaborate view of the 5 principles, but it is not a long-term strategy. It's very difficult to evolve, to build such a strategy with so many divergent interests also inside the EU. But one problem is the uncertainty of, all the changes in the world, power relations, and my impression is that both sides, both the EU and Russia, seem to think that they have time on their side, that it is not really necessary to get closer, because Russia sees the EU as, not maybe falling apart, but having big internal problems. The EU tends, on our side, we tend to see Russia as a declining power. And in the meantime, you have the US and China, and we are somewhere in between and somewhere unable to find our own more independent or more sovereign positions. I was part of a bigger exercise in the context of the EU-Russia Expert Network, which is sponsored by the European Union, and where we have a close cooperation with the Russian Institute of External Affairs, RIAC, and we developed some together. So it was a joint Russian-European exercise, a number of alternative scenarios for EU-Russia relations in 2030. And what we all consider the most realistic one was cold partnership. And, one may say, it doesn't sound really very great. But still, I mean, to end on an optimistic note, even a cold partnership is still some form of partnership. And this was discussed recently also in Valdai, so it's getting some kind of traction, and I hope that when there would be a new edition of the book, we could also incorporate some of these ideas in as far as they are also developed into policies, either on the EU side or on the Russian side. Thanks.
Okay, so now, last but not least, we have our speaker from Russia, from St. Petersburg, Tatiana Romanova. I hope that you're ready and that you can start. So in any case, Tatiana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fabienne, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for these excellent speeches. I will go back to my task of discussants, and my first point on the basis of this discussion and on the basis of 2 keynote speeches is that clearly the 5 principles still stand, although their substance has slightly evolved, not in the best direction, I would say. So if you took the first principle, I think the 2 speeches expose that we are still far away from having some sort of a solution, or at least moving to sort of like containing the conflict in the shared neighborhood or in the contested neighborhood. And we are still in the process of who is to be blamed. If you talk about strengthening of the EU's relations with Eastern Partnership countries. Yeah? So we still see quite a lot of blame shifting on both sides. Yeah? If you take resilience, the threats to which the European Union has to be resilient, at least according to the official documents and according to the speeches. So those threats have slightly evolved in the sense that initially energy and the EU's energy dependence was figuring high there. Now it's more about disinformation, fake news, and those things. If you speak about selective engagement, then we probably see much more discussions on selective engagement in the field of climate. But yet there is very little progress. So there are frameworks, sort of like declarations on that, but not substantive advances in that field. We still declare that medicine, vaccination can be fields of selective engagement, but again, that sort of like amounts to declarations only, and then when we move to technicalities, there are mutual reproaches of who is to be blamed. The Arctic, which was mentioned in the book as a case of potential selective engagement, again was mentioned today as the area where the parties still, well, Russia and the EU have not found any agreement. And I'm also, I appreciate sort of like civil society engagement being rated as the most successful by our co-editors, but I also share the skeptics how far we are, especially because we have different tracks, sort of like state-sponsored, sort of like civil society dialogue, and then EU-sponsored, well, Russia-sponsored sort of like civil society dialogue if we speak about the engagement between the Civic Chamber and the European Economic and Social Committee, and then the civil society dialogue, which is sponsored by the European Union. So there are two different tracks that are in a way parallel, but not necessarily interlinking with each other. And of course, COVID didn't help here, because we see, well, limited, sort of like much more limited dialogue between civil societies compared to what we used to have. And I guess the fact that I speak to you from the screen is a very clear illustration of that. I do not agree with the two keynote speakers that economy does not figure in the book. In fact, it does figure. It is scattered across three principles, and the fact that it's scattered across the three principles has been meaning resilience, selective engagement, but also sanctions that are related to the Minsk, in fact reflects the poor quality of economic relations. Yes, the EU is still the biggest trade partner for Russia. Russia is a very significant trade partner for the European Union, but our economic relations are deteriorating. Partly due to sanctions and auto-restrictive measures, if you wish, and I would argue that sort of like both sides contributed to the fact that trade relations decrease. It's also about the cautious pivot to the west, to the east, but it is also about the fact that economic relations get poorer. Well, is also the result of the EU's Green Deal. It's the flip side of the EU's Green Deal. And as we move along, that will progress unless we look for a possibility to revise our relations on the basis of the energy transition and climate change. There is a lot of talk about it on both sides. But again, if we look at the progress that has been done, that remains relatively limited. And I think that was also expressed in the keynote speeches and in Connie's comments that we just heard. The principles, the 5 principles, certainly helped the European Union to be more coherent as a actor, and we got a confirmation about that from the 2 speeches. And in a way, they helped the European Union to deal with Russia, but they also, in a way, helped Russia to deal with the European Union in the sense that the contacts were kept to the minimum as a result of the five results. So it's an unfortunate simplicity for Russia. And of course, we all agree that the five principles are not a long-term strategy. And the argument is that once the relations get better, we'll have a longer-term strategy. But then you can also say that because we don't have a longer-term strategy, the relations are so poor. So it is a vicious circle, or it becomes a vicious circle as a result. There is a long-standing debate about the mutual influence of the academia and the practitioners, and whether practitioners influence the academia, or whether the academia to an extent influences the practitioners. And I think it's positive that we speak so much about divergent perceptions, divergent images that the European Union has about Russia and Russia has about the European Union, divergent perceptions of security, divergent pictures of the pictures. So it's good that we talk, and that definitely is a positive influence of the academia. It's the recognition of this difference is, I believe, the basis for re-establishment of trust. But at the same time, I think because also demonstrated that we still have difficulty hearing each other. Because on the one hand, we still insist on equality. On the other hand, the EU says, okay, you equal must fulfill our conditions and get back to what we believe is correct. So these are two narratives. These are two narratives that are convergent in any way. I think it is positive that we discuss the problem between the non-set on the one hand and the non-take on the other hand, and the fact that Russia is not ready any longer to be a non-taker. That Russia wants to be among non-setters. But equally, I think we need a recognition that the European Union is not ready to take Russia as one of the non-setters. And the discussion about the rules of international law is a very nice illustration of that. And the European Union wants to sort of like bring it to technicalities, but it's more than technicalities. Yes, I agree that probably needs legal approximation in terms of standards more than Russia, because Russia is an export. But it's not just the norms. Because it's also about who sets the norms, who determines the rules of the game is extremely important. And Russia might not be credible as a non-setter at no moment, but Russia is credible as a challenger. And one of the reasons why Russian challengers do not challenge us is because it feels it's not included in the development or in the shaping. I was very impressed by the discussion in the European country, and that's something that we haven't heard from Russian officials for quite a long period of time. Although that's the immediately talked about Russia like being a two-headed eagle, oriented towards Asia. But I think the fact that Russian official representatives recognize again also European culture is the basis for the discussion. But equally, the European Union cannot monopolize the notion of saying that it is only authority on behalf of Europe. And that's again about perception. And if we recognize the difference that exists, if we take them into account, that will be the basis for a longer-term vision, EU-Russian relations, which will probably be more pragmatic. Some can say that it is more transactional, but most probably more interest-based, and recognizing the specificity of the partners. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
proceed with the Q&A because actually we're already run out of time. But that's of course also because this is such a complicated and an extensive topic to discuss. So we will have questions. We already had one question from the chat from the people following via live stream. So I will address that because it's targeted at briefly address it. But in the meantime, you also if you would like to ask a question, you can raise your hand. Now unfortunately we cannot pass around a microphone due to regulations. It's too tricky if you pass around a microphone. So this means that we will ask you to stand up as loudly as possible. I will try to repeat the question. At least I've fully understood the question. But let me first address the question that was asked by someone following online. And I think there has been standing on actually when it comes to the notion that the principle of society was successful, the most successful among all aspects of the five principles. I think what we wanted to say is that the fifth principle as such has been successful, and that of course civil society is part of that. Indeed, civil society is challenging and increasingly challenging. What has been less challenging is more the EU's continued funding of higher education collaborations, which as one of the authors has also shown, has also been increasing, and then increasing from Russia's side, from Russian higher education institutions, an increasing interest to collaborating with the EU, whether it's through Erasmus or through Horizon 2020. So that's what I was this fifth principle has been successful. So it's not necessarily civil society support aspect, which admittedly is becoming increasingly challenging the current circumstances. It's more about cooperation, for instance, the higher education level, but also in terms of research cooperation. So this basically what we meant when we said that the fifth most successful. But now I would like to open the floor to people here also. If anyone would like to ask a question, raise your hand, but also stand up so that we can hear you clearly. Go ahead. The floor is yours. That's a very long question for me to repeat. But I think the question was, can you become a truly geopolitical actor, and is there not the risk that the member states will become even more divergent? I hope I summarized correctly. There's another question there, is yours. Yes, the floor is yours. Okay, thank you. So I will repeat your question, which is easier, considering it's short, but also because it's for Tatiana and for the ambassador, especially for Tatiana. So the question was, why is Russia's approach to international law different than the EU's approach to international law? Okay, I think we can take one more question. So the lady in the front. Okay, thank you. So here I also will repeat the question for people following online. So here you wonder about why Russia has treated the case of Serbia differently than the case of Ukraine, and you think maybe it's just because Ukraine used to be part of the Soviet Union, whereas Serbia was not. It was, of course, within the Soviet influence or sphere of influence, but it was not a member of the Soviet Union. Okay, so that's it for 3 questions. So I will perhaps first give Tatiana the opportunity to respond to that second question, which concerned the fact that why is Russia's approach to international law different than the EU's approach to international law?
Details. Can you just come over to this mic and repeat it? Not to the big microphone. Yeah.
The question was why...
No, we can't. I can't hear you now. I think it's switched off.
Okay, can you hear me now? Tatiana, can you hear me? Do you hear me now?
Now I
okay. The question was why Russia's approach to international law is different from the EU's approach to international law. So how do you explain the divergence here with respect to the approach to international law?
Well, I think lawyers would always argue that there is the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. And what we see in EU-Russian relations at the moment is that each side tries to interpret the letter of the law in a different way. And I would say that the EU's concept of the rules-based society is the EU's interpretation of what the spirit of the law should be. And it might be a good interpretation on one occasion, it can be a bad interpretation on a different occasion. But the problem, I guess, with that from the Russian point of view, and I'm trying to explain the Russian point of view as I understand it, is that Russia renounces a unilateral interpretation of European Union, saying that, look, this is international law. The interpretation might evolve, but the West and the European Union in particular shouldn't have the monopoly for interpreting the law. That other actors should participate in this interpretation and reinterpretation of the law. So that's the crux of the matter, as I understand it. But Ambassador Chizhov probably can develop it further.
Does it work? Now it works. Okay. I won't argue with what the previous speaker said, but let me focus on a slightly different issue. Russia focuses on universality of international law, as outlined by the UN Charter. So, of course, international law is a living mechanism, a living creature, I would say, not a multi-headed monster. And of course, today international events sometimes pose problems and challenges that had been unthinkable back in 1945 and before that, like the use of unmanned aerial vehicles, like IT, information technology. But that does not mean, that's why international lawyers are working day and night on developing new norms, new conventions. But all those efforts should be addressed to the international community as a whole. We do not support the view promoted not only by the European Union, by the United States as well, that some of the more advanced countries are better placed, better positioned to go further in terms of developing certain international legal norms. I can refer to an upcoming event in Washington, a summit of democracies, as announced by President Biden. I've been told officially that the EU is proud to have been invited. Perhaps. Of course, it will be interesting to see whether all EU member states are invited, and what other countries, and what is the criteria. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So then we have the two other questions left. I suppose that perhaps Mr. De Vigne could respond to the question concerning Serbia.
Thank you. Yes, thanks for these questions. The situation is actually more simple than you think. First of all, there is a myth that you have to get out of your head, maybe, and I know this is a myth that was in a way planted by Russian, I wouldn't say propaganda, but disinformation, is that you can't be part of two FTAs. That's completely wrong. Yeah, there is EU is the largest trading partner of US largest trading partner of EU. US started a free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico. Mexico had already an FTA with EU. It doesn't create problems. You know, what I do with my neighbor on the left, if I make a free trade agreement, does not affect my trade between me and the ambassador, or between them two. It's completely different. By the way, Ukraine represents, if you remove energy, which is not regulated by the EU-Ukraine, if you want, because Ukraine and EU do not produce energy. But if you remove energy from Russia and Ukraine trade, Ukraine represents something like 2% of Russian exports. So it's nothing to do with economics. The thing has to do with politics and the perception. This is a fundamental problem. The perception, I believe, that Russia has of international relations as zero-sum game. You are with me or you are against me. In a way, it's a very Stalinian way of looking at things. Divide the world in zones, and you trespassing because you go in my zone. But there is nothing in the agreement, for instance, with Ukraine or the other association agreement or agreement in partnership that deal with security. Nothing. Let alone NATO. I'll move to Monsieur Thoman, who's always the first to jump with long questions. NATO. What is the EU is not NATO. The NATO is not EU. You know, the EU has members which are not members of NATO, etc. And I know your narrative that it's all because of Sikorsky and all the others. But what about the others? What about the other member states? The other member states all follow one country or one vision. President Macron is called NATO brain dead. Everybody knows this. And then what? And then you think that the whole EU is following a pro-NATO, I don't know, policy of expansion to the east. This is completely mythical. Atlantic to Ural, yes, but as I said before, it was Russia who unplugged the economic negotiations in 2012, not the EU. There was no more progress possible because Russia didn't want to deepen, if you want, these disciplines and rules between our trade that we need so much. So I think this is fundamental misconception. It's really black and white attitude. I don't know. Personally, I don't get it. I don't get it to believe that countries who have notoriously good relations with Russia, traditionally for centuries, France, Germany, Austria, Benelux, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece. So all these countries went into a hostile Russian policy? It doesn't make any sense. Thank you.
So thank you very much once more for your answers to the questions. I mean, taking into account the time, I think this is also a perfect time to finish this evening. We run a little bit out of time, but nevertheless, I want to thank you very much for your attendance, for your interest in the topic, and I can also announce that there will be other lectures organized within the framework of the Ghent Russia platform, starting one on Monday, dealing with Russia's constitutional developments. So you're all kindly invited to attend that one as well. You can find more information on the website of the Russia platform. And let me thank also in particular all the speakers for taking the time to be with us this evening in this still very difficult and complex time. So thank you very much.